The title here, TBI Across the Lifespan, admittedly, oh gosh, no, that's okay. So my bread and butter as a clinician, a speech language clinician, I think I've shared that with all of y'all now, has definitely focused on pediatrics, especially school aged. So definitely that's where my knowledge lies, but have been really fortunate to work among a group of folks where we really do work across the lifespan. So I'll share with you, not so much, especially given the audience here, not so much what TBI looks like across the lifespan, but I think a little bit more focused on how we can sort of maximize as advocates, for children or other survivors, how we can best sort of work with them to maximize productivity across the lifespan. So this will be less scientific and hopefully more hands-on, hopefully. So one of the things we've discovered with brain injury, and you guys probably all know this now, when I think of the difference between the younger end of the age range and the older end of the age range, if you don't mind going to the next one, I do want to share some of what we've learned. Essentially, we know that kids with brain injury are not just like adults with brain injury for a lot of reasons, but in particular, and I'm going to kind of dig into some of those specifics, what we've really found is how important it is to be vigilant with kids, especially at a younger age of injury, and really continue to follow them in the long term. So that we've been really vocal in the field, not only the scientific community, but also clinical community, of how important it is to, especially for a young person, not just assume they're out of the woods after that first year or so, but really, really stay vigilant. In fact, it sounds, for some people it sounds kind of jarring, but we like to think about TBI in a similar way to childhood cancer, in the sense of always staying on top of them to make sure that they stay in regression, if you will. So taking that same model, I think, is really important. Just considering they're still growing, they're still developing. Another really exciting thing in brain research right now, we've learned so much about the potential for regeneration, and that's huge, especially for those of us who are clinicians. We essentially get to work with them to harness their own neuroplasticity, be their own neuroengineers. Actually, all the kids I work with, I tell them that. I tell them, you are a neuroengineer. Did you know that? Do you know how you can do that? And knowing that they can really kind of put themselves in the driver's seat of something for a change is really remarkable and empowering. So I love that we can, although there may be a lot of, it's the doom and gloom that makes the headlines, it's so neat to be able to be in a position where we can really empower and infuse hope in terms of the potential that they really have. And then in that same vein, the last word here, and I've got some new efforts I'm really excited about here in what can we do to actually build resilience. And I'm so excited that y'all are wrapping up the day today with a talk about resilience, because it's not just one thing. There's physical resilience, in that physical sense. There's also kind of the emotional, but what we're really interested in from an injury standpoint is the potential for actually kind of putting your brain in a stronger position to begin with. Is there potential to make your brain stronger such that if you ever have an injury, or say have a repeat injury or whatnot, that it won't be as significant, or you'll have a better recovery. There's actually some exciting research to give some promise in these areas. So again, a whole new frontier. Was just sharing with her, and you've probably heard it said, we've learned more about the brain in the last 10 years than in all the years before that put together. So we'll have a lot more to learn about these things as we move forward. Sorry, go ahead to the next slide. I'm not going to tell you all this because y'all know this, but in case you didn't, I think one thing when we think about advocates, just the conversation I had with my Uber driver yesterday, and they always ask, what do you do? And I mentioned, wow, what's TBI? What is that? And, most people are floored by this idea of, this is actually the most common cause of long-term disability for children in our country. And people just go, what? I thought it was cancer or this or that. And so just recognizing this is something that touches all of us in one way or another, I think is important. If you go to the next slide, I took this even just from an awareness standpoint. If you think about incidents, and these numbers are old now, it eclipses, those other things that might get a lot more attention or have a lot more support. So I so appreciate advocates and organizations that are really big in raising awareness so that folks will know how to take action and that they can. So if you go to the next one, in terms of lifespan, no, this is not the lifespan slide. It's interesting. We've seen some unique trends over the last few years. The CDC just updated their big report on TBI incidence in the country and what that looks like. And basically, to simplify the graph here, if you look at just between 2001 and 2010, in terms of mortality and death, the green line, it's going down, 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 which is wonderful. And I appreciated Dr. Clark kind of putting up that statistic that like 94% are being survived now, which is wonderful. But that means there's a bigger need for long-term advocates than ever before, right? So one of the things we've seen kind of go up dramatically since, say, 2007 is those emergency department visits. So as you were sharing, your own story from years ago, maybe not ever even thinking to go to the emergency department, that's changed. So even folks who've had those milder injuries, maybe didn't even lose consciousness, I think we're certainly seeing folks seeking treatment. So a lot of folks ask, is it really that we have more brain injuries, or is it just that more people are getting treated and identified? We don't know, but I have a feeling that awareness has helped a lot. If you go to the next one, this was another one that came out in the medical community that got a lot of interest. Hey, come on in. And basically just showing this dramatic uptick in those ED visits. It's interesting because specifically ED visits for TBI, it was at a rate 8 times higher than that of ED visits overall. So in terms of the uptick being pretty specific to people seeking treatment for brain injury. But from a lifespan perspective, the biggest increase was seen in children under 3 and adults over 60. So in particular, really seeing folks seek treatment. If you'll go to the next slide, this is one that the CDC released that really breaks it down by age group. So you'll notice, if you look at these kind of being 2-year age ranges from 2000 all the way to 2010, the red line is the one that looks really different from the others. That's our early childhood, our 0 to 4 group. So whereas kind of that rate was pretty stable beginning at about 2007, that's the group that we really saw an increase in ED visits. And again, still trying to get to the bottom of, is it just that more kids are having injuries, or are parents now, a lot more readily wanting to go and have them checked out? We don't know. I will share a story. We have a local physician. We work I'm from Dallas. Welcome, by the way. Our Children's Medical Center in Dallas. We have some great physicians there, just like y'all have here at Dell. And one in particular has shared, she feels like in recent years, just anecdotally, she's seen a big uptick in the number of shaken infants and toddlers. Shaken baby syndrome, you may have heard. Essentially, what is the word? Non-accidental trauma. And this could be a really sticky situation for physicians because it's hard to identify that abuse really happened as opposed to, say, a fall. And once you make that accusation, that's a big deal. So there are a lot of physicians involved in research to see what are the best markers of, say, a child who's been shaken versus a child who's fallen. One thing, for example, that can often be a common marker are retinal hemorrhages in a shaking incident relative to a fall where you wouldn't expect that. But anyway, I found that interesting and a little concerning that she feels like, especially in those really young ones, one thing that's been driving it are some of these aspects. So if you'll go to the next slide, again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because you guys know this, considering the audience. But again, from a lifespan perspective, I find that last one really interesting. If you go back one more. because, we see that the mechanism of injury is going to vary a lot over the age range, and Dr. Clark shared this as well. So again, on those extremes, the young ones and our older ones, oftentimes it is falls that are diagnosed as the cause. But we see during those teenage years, those driving years, those early driving years, the real uptick in the motor vehicle accidents, as well as kind of the assaults in the young adulthood time as well. So TBI does look very different, typically, depending on the age of the person coming in. So if you go to the next slide. So I realized too, although my expertise is TBI, really, a lot of this applies to brain injury at large in terms of what I'll be talking about from this point on. So not only traumatic brain injuries, but also acquired brain injuries, such as from anoxia. And if you'll move forward, I think one thing, so I teach a class through our speech language pathology department at UT Dallas. And one of the things I really love to emphasize with my graduate students is, again, from an advocacy perspective, working with families who've been impacted by brain injury can be very different than working with families who, say, have a child with, say, a developmental disability, other aspects, for a few reasons. One, with brain injury, this was an event that happened suddenly, right? So there's that, for most, there is going to be some sort of pre-injury concept of normal. What was their normal before? And that's going to be different than their new normal, most likely. And that's not something that you would equate with, say, a child with autism, for example. Also, oftentimes with brain injury, especially in kids, there may be really inconsistent patterns of performance. So just as you get comfortable with, okay, this is how it is, suddenly something's going to change, right? Especially as they're still developing and recovering. Again, can be a lot of variability and fluctuation. One thing that we see in brain injury, which can be distinct from a lot of our other, again, more pediatric disabilities, is sometimes problems generalizing and integrating information. That can be a challenge, particular kind of call to action for clinicians. What can we do to really build skills that are gonna be easily transferable for them? Folks where they're really going to see how what I'm working on here is going to impact what I'm doing out there. How can we really build those bridges for them? One on the positive side, one of the good things we see, especially if you think about like a student with brain injury, is typically there's going to be some previously learned base of information, which is going to assist in relearning. So helping them reconnect with their knowledge base. Essentially, the skills and knowledge they've already acquired can help as you kind of rebuild. And that's a positive. So if you'll go to the next slide, I want to spend a little bit, since this is about the lifespan, a little bit more about kind of the distinctions between the developing brain relative to the adult brain. But then I really want to spend the bulk of our time with talking about some of those advocacy elements. So if you go to the next slide. Again, I borrowed from, this is my mentor, Dr. Chapman, who's the director of our center and longtime researcher in child TBI. She's been involved in this work since about 1989. And I really think this quote kind of hits the nail on the head for many folks, is thinking about TBI as a chronic condition in the sense of long-term monitoring and being really vigilant in how we can help mitigate some potential later emerging or persistent deficits to really ensure maximum regeneration and performance. So she doesn't introduce this idea of a chronic condition as a doom and gloom, but rather, hey, it's important to kind of, stay on top of it and recognize the potential for re-engaging and making positive gains any point in recovery. Anybody who's been injured years ago likely told you, well, yeah, I was told that kind of what you see at 1 year is what you got, right? And that was just the pervasive approach, and that could not be further from the truth, right? And
as recently as 3 years ago.
You're kidding me.
Yeah.
Oh, it's so disheartening when I hear that, right? But we've got to change that. We've got to change that. one of the things we get excited about, I've worked a lot with folks at that more chronic stage, if you will. So since I'm not in the hospital or the rehab setting, it's folks, who are back out in the community. And in one of our adult brain injury studies, we were working with folks as much as 30 years post-injury, and they were making positive gains. So truly, it is never too late. If you go to the next slide. So one of the things where we've really been able to learn so much, I mentioned in the last talk I did, we've been a part of essentially what is the longest running study following kids and teens in their recovery from brain injury in the country, multi-site study. And over the years, we've focused largely on sort of longitudinal assessments. In other words, recruiting kids at the time of injury, work a lot with Children's Hospital, some of the other big hospitals in Dallas and Houston, even Miami and Toronto. Dr. Clark mentioned being at Sick Kids Hospital in Ontario. We've partnered with them as well. But basically, it's all about following them in their recovery and learning about what recovery can look like and what are the things that help and all these moving pieces. How can we kind of pull from that evidence and carry that forward to others? And so we've looked at a lot of things over the years. We definitely do a lot of cognitive assessment, but also all those other elements, whether it's kind of the mental health components. And one of the reasons we've learned so much about the brain truly is brain imaging. We've been able to really get in there and watch the brain in action. So, now we have tools at our disposal that go beyond MRI to actual functional imaging. Are you all familiar with the concept of fMRI? So it's still usually in the research context, not really something that's being done a lot yet clinically, but basically you can watch the brain in action, whether it's just kind of what is your brain doing at rest, or if I give you something to do, like a memory task, how does your brain tackle that? We've learned so much, especially about how the brain recovers, but also how the brain responds to different kinds of treatments by using functional imaging. So how we're changing the brain, essentially, which is really cool. Most recently, with our kiddos with brain injury, what we found to be most informative in terms of how we can best support them is getting a better picture for their recovery in some of these higher order functions. So executive functions, how they're doing things like planning and controlling their emotions and exhibiting judgment and reasoning. And then also the social world has become really key for our youth, especially our teens with injury. If you go to the next slide. So again, these are some of those high points for a lot of our individuals. If you'll go to the next slide. So with young ones, what we really have to think about is the potential for there being a lot of variability in recovery based on their age, and maybe even the potential for some sort of delayed onset of challenges as they hit later milestones. So if you'll go to the next slide. Again, this is just a snapshot of some of the areas from a brain perspective that can be impacted after injury, but y'all know this stuff. So if you'll go to the next slide, just to kind of give it a finer point, if y'all heard my last talk, you'll know that one of the things I'm really passionate about is using language as a window into their cognitive functioning. And so things like a task where you share a story or text with them and ask them to summarize it for you. How did they process that? What are they retaining? And more importantly, what sort of meaning are they getting out of it? As something that's been shown to be very sensitive to some of the challenges for our kiddos with TBI. We're also really interested in problem-solving skills, how that relates not just in the context of daily tasks, but also social situations and behavior. We're also looking at not just memory per se, but how they're having to hold on to information and do things with it in real time, working memory. And then also very interested in what can we do to really intervene early so as to hopefully mitigate some of those more maladaptive behaviors. So starting to get involved in things that take them down a different path. So you go to the next slide. So one of the things that universally, we've been frustrated with, you guys have a wonderful healthcare system here, but so many don't across the country. And just considering how pervasive TBI is, typical follow-up, even let's say in a severe injury like this young man's, and I'll tell you a little bit more about him in a minute, days, maybe maybe even weeks in the hospital, followed by rehab if they're lucky. And then after rehab, it's like, all right, maybe here's some recommendations as you go back to school. But truthfully, any sort of additional follow-up care may be really limited after that point. In fact, I think especially for kids, it's like, well, we're fortunate we don't just have to rely on insurance here. We can put them in the school, and provided they can qualify for services, the school can provide them the rehab they need, if you will. And unfortunately, more often than not, that does not happen. I do a lot of my work is, in fact, from an advocacy standpoint, is going in and really working with the schools, educating the teams, and just, if anything, just helping them sort of take the baton and really following through. So to boil it down, what have we learned from our longitudinal work in brain injury? Younger is not better. So whereas we really think of kids as very resilient and plastic, if you will, in many senses that's very true, especially physically. But when it comes to learning and cognition, unfortunately, many times the opposite is true. And it kind of boils down to this sort of paradox in that the prognosis for recovery of old skills may be better in earlier injury, so things they've already acquired, but the prognosis for acquiring new skills after injury is what is often so impacted. You can imagine there's a whole lot more learning left to happen for a 4-year-old than there is for a 44-year-old. So that's really where the difference is as we think about lifespan and TBI. So the notion of being proactive as we're working with the younger child is really key. So if you go to the next slide. Again, Dr. Chapman, one of the terms that she coined in the literature, whereas we had put so much emphasis on sort of the immediate stage of brain injury, where if you think about this as development, and we definitely see that sort of downturn, but then a dramatic uptick typically for kiddos. If you'll go to the next slide, that may be when they're getting a lot of supports. But then if you look later, they call it sort of the latent phase, maybe a year or more after injury. If you'll go to the next slide, that's where we may see this phenomenon. She termed it a neurocognitive stall. So it kind of appears, if you look at the blue being typical development, suddenly it looks like they're getting worse, but they're not. It's just that, that gap between them and their peers may be getting farther and farther, as they hit these other stages and may not have what they need to really experience that same development. So if you'll go to the next slide, it's not that they're losing ground, but rather, need more of a kickstart when it comes to taking on that next level of development relative to their peers. Now, the good news in all of this is we can absolutely make an impact here and help put them back up on that trajectory. So, in short, with children, they're not just little adults. Some impairments may appear to even get worse over time, or new difficulties might emerge years later, where at that point they might not even think to connect the dots, between what we're seeing now versus then. Essentially, kids, it's important to kind of look at each stage of development and how we can keep them on track. If you'll go to the next slide, basically we look at several different domains, not only cognition and learning, but we also have to think about kind of the behavioral, psychosocial pieces. Sleep gets its own category now with brain injury, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. But I love to tell stories, especially I think for advocates, because this is one remarkable story. This is Craig, and in fact, if y'all have been in this world long, you may have met his mom. She's been a very outspoken advocate with Mothers Against Drunk Driving, with MAD, especially in the Dallas area. But Craig, he was 4 years old when he was crossing the street with his mom and his siblings and was hit by a drunk driver while crossing the street. In this case, I've heard his mom tell the story. It's one where it was a female driver, and the police caught her miles down the road, and some of Craig's clothing was still on her bumper. It was just one of those devastating, and truly, medically, he was a miracle in many ways. Remarkable recovery given the severity of his injuries. He had to relearn everything, walking, talking, bowel control, you name it. But phenomenal recovery. Got him back on track, started school with his peers, and seemed to be doing just okay. Mom was like, we are out of the woods. Thank goodness he had this injury at such a young age, essentially. And we were fortunate because we got connected with them, and he was entered in our longitudinal study. And so we got to continue to follow up 6 months, a year. We follow up more when they're young and then kind of space it out. And yeah, was progressing nicely in elementary. When he hit about 11 years old, he took a nosedive. Essentially, what we saw was not only academic difficulties, but behaviorally, socially, just as his mom would describe it, it was like he was a changed child, just really, really challenged. And when we really look at brain development, gosh, this is the age at which there's a whole new important stage that happens, particularly with these higher order skills. When we think about executive functioning, social functioning. And again, we were very fortunate to be involved with them. We got him in and really worked with him intensively, gave him some proactive supports, and happy to report he's one that absolutely got back on that positive trajectory. In fact, his first job when he was 16, he got a job while he was in high school at a local grocery store. And his very first paycheck he donated to the center. We're just like, oh, because he's just thought, just the value of continuing to make sure there are supports like that for kids in the long term. Because, he would say, who knows where I'd be if folks weren't supporting me that way.
It's related to the neural pruning that occurs in the frontal lobes in adolescence.
Yeah.
They're actually losing some.
Well, in a way, and I actually talked about it in my last talk because I'm fascinated with this whole neural pruning that happens, especially kind of across the adolescent years, because that's done just in typical development as a way to help us sort of prune our bush, become stronger. And yeah, oftentimes in injury, there may be some certain foundations, even at that physiological level, where that typical development is disrupted in one way or another. And we see that manifest in particular in a lot of these once they're having to call upon these new sort of frontally driven skills. And I mean, the good news, again, I'm happy to report this picture was taken a few years ago now when he was 25. He's late 20s now, but has a successful career and is really an amazing advocate in his own right as well. But the reason I love to tell his story too is one, it demonstrates just how remarkable that initial recovery can seem, but how important it is to really, be proactive and continue to support in the long run, especially as they hit these later stages. If you'll go to the next slide. I want to spend some time talking about some of the potential effects that can really have an impact on the family unit, and then how we can sort of work within that. So if you go to the next slide, I'm probably going to skip through a few of these. I talked about this last time, but I think the teen years are a time when it's really important to engage the whole family for a lot of reasons. It's when these kiddos have high horsepower and no steering, just to put simply. If you'll go to the next slide, it's a really, really optimal time in life, but also very vulnerable. And for a lot of reasons, if you'll go to the next slide, a lot of it comes back down to this frontal lobe development. You'll skip to the next one. Again, these are all these skills that are so key in really setting the stage for adulthood. If you'll go to the next slide. All these things that are really about goals, being able to make goals, plan out your steps to achieve them, initiate it, monitor, all that good stuff. If you'll go to the next slide. One of the things we've put a big lens on for our teens is some of those mental health and other psychiatric components, because it becomes really important in these years. You're seeing it a lot even in the mild TBI or the concussion literature, how sort of teens can be distinct. We think about onset of injury. It's not unusual to have some pre-injury, would be psychiatric challenges in children who sustain TBI. That could be as high as a third to a half of kids who have an injury, let's say if they sustain it during the adolescent years. And if you'll go ahead and go to the next slide. One of the things that is probably most jarring for the family unit, and I don't know if y'all have ever encountered this, more typical in our more moderate to severe injuries is personality change. So there's actually a psychiatric diagnosis of this. We've worked with one of the pediatric psychiatrists that really kind of helped form this, but it truly is where after the injury, they have a shift in their personality. It could be temporary, but it can also be persistent. And basically, they have 5 different types they look at. The labile is somebody who's really just all over the map emotionally. So maybe those folks who will suddenly be overly happy when they really shouldn't. Things like that. Disinhibited kind of speaks for itself. The aggressive. Apathetic can look a lot like depression, but is very specific to apathy, or lack of motivation. There's even a paranoid type, which can show kind of some aspects that look like paranoid schizophrenia. If you go to the next one, next slide, please. Yeah.
With the personality types, we see anxiety as being really prominent in the young adults that we're treating.
For sure.
Is there a particular personality type that matches with?
I'll talk about that. So anxiety, for example, like an anxiety disorder, and I'm not a psychologist here, it's separate from this personality change diagnosis. This is really whole part and parcel of the personality as a whole. But it can co-occur with an anxiety disorder, for example. There's a study that came out of California several years ago that found about 40% of kids with severe TBI exhibited some ongoing persistent personality change, an average of 2 years after injury. That's huge. That's a lot of kids. And an additional 20% had a more transient change, so it was more temporary. And in the cases of the mild to moderates, change occurred in only about 5%. It was always transient. So essentially, this personality change seems to really be skewed more to those who have had the severe injuries. And some of the predictors are also beyond severity, some lesions specifically in some frontal areas. We know ADHD can also be a big one for our students after brain injury. And they found that almost a third of kids with severe TBI develop ADHD after the injury if they didn't already have that diagnosis. If there were some pre-injury behavior problems, that puts them at even greater risk. If you'll go on. And then we always have to be very mindful of depression. Now, depression and anxiety kind of manifest differently in kids at different ages. Basically, what we found is that when you look at kids 6 months after injury, again, across the spectrum from mild to severe, they found depressive disorders after the injury in about 11%. But it was significantly associated with older age at the time of injury. Now, these are all kids. Also, if they had a family history of anxiety disorder, some other frontal involvement. And 40% of these kids had an anxiety disorder on top of it. So again, very important as we look at the co-occurrence here. Interestingly, though, the depression was more seen in those kids who are older at injury. If you'll go to the next slide, the anxiety, on the other hand, was marginally associated with younger age at injury and with those who were coming in with some pre-injury anxiety concerns. So a lot of times these things sort of go hand in hand with each other, but I think it's very important to think about how this sort of factors into the family functioning as a whole and how we can, again, really be proactive about our supports, because these things can have such a huge impact on their day-to-day. If you'll go on. Another thing just to share with y'all, quick pop quiz. Okay, there are 2 neurons up there. Admittedly, these are rat neurons, not humans, but which would you say is the healthiest? The one on the left or the right?
Say right.
The one on the right? Okay. Anybody think the one on the left? You guys are good. The one on the right is healthier. How can you tell?
There's more activity.
More lit up.
Neurons thrive on connection, right? Exactly, and they've actually done studies that look at the impact of chronic stress on the brain. Now, I use the term chronic. A little stress is not a bad thing, but chronic stress, when your brain is in that state, you're releasing those neurotransmitters, that cortisol, those other aspects, it can actually reduce neuronal activity. And they're really looking at the relationship, again, across the lifespan now, to depression, anxiety, and even rage as we look at some of our adult populations. But this, in turn, can impact memory and how effective the neurons are. So all of this really comes full circle as we think about an individual with brain injury and that's operating in a system. If you'll move on. If you'll go to the next slide, one of the things I have to share with you, because it was so impactful for me when I first got into this field, and you're seeing research emerge all over the country, looking at our juvenile criminal justice systems. And there's research coming out all over that have seen as high as 80% of individuals in our criminal justice system have a history of TBI. This is huge, huge. And of course, they're looking at, there's actually, the state of Texas just participated in a massive research study where they're going in and doing TBI screenings in the general criminal justice system, including juvenile, and really getting a better handle on that, like chicken or the egg sort of aspect. But undoubtedly, we know this is a really big issue. And so, again, it gives us pause to think about, is there any potential in this sort of preemptive or proactive approach as we think about our youth and some of these, potential effects of their injury and maladaptive behaviors and how we can hopefully play a role. If you'll move on. So I come back to that personality change in particular. These are some of the quotes from parents, we've engaged with when they think about especially their teenage child after injury. And you can, again, imagine how this weighs on the relationship and the functioning in the family as a whole. If you'll move on, please. So I think it's important for all of us, anybody who works with these families and individuals, to really capture the need for support and how we can best provide that throughout the continuum of recovery, not just while they're in our care, but also being vigilant while they're in the community as well. So if you'll go on, I'm going to run through this actually. If you'll skip, since we're low on time, we know it can impact the family in a lot of different ways. There are some great tools online. Brainline.org is one of my favorites that even brings in stories about tips for siblings and really just how to have some positive interactions to help. If you'll move on. And also that another really important time where a lot of folks get lost is that transition to adulthood. So let's say they're graduating from the school system and what's next? It really challenging, especially as you think about kids who've maybe just had a pediatric care provider this whole time and now they have to find an adult provider who doesn't know about this and that. And there was a big survey that went out to kind of capture what are the needs that we need to be aware of at this age and stage, and it really hit the need for continued care. How can we carry that forward and continue to provide them access to positive peer relationships, social interactions, and so forth. If you'll go on. And these are the kinds of things we want to help avoid, right? We've actually seen that high school dropout rates for students with disabilities are greater than 25%. So for them to make it to that point and then to make this choice, if we can really be a voice to help prevent that from happening. And then at the level of employment, the rates are really high in our individuals with brain injury. If you'll go to the next one. So some of the successful trends we're seeing is especially, again, being proactive, beginning about 14 or 16, getting involved with the school to build those transition plans, those goals, getting them experience to that early vocational training or really putting out the feelers when it comes to college, if that's the track they're seeking, really seeing some positive trends given those supports. So if you'll move on, please. If I had time, I'd show you this, but I'm always happy to share my slides. There are some wonderful YouTube videos. This is a little vignette of a counselor in a school meeting with a student, a high school student, to talk about next steps for her, a student with brain injury. It shows first situation is how not to do it, and the second situation is how to do it. But essentially, the first one is, it's how we would probably tend to do it, kind of a little bit confrontational, like kind of shooting down expectations a little bit. And the second one is absolutely reframing that in a way that allows her to sort of think about her options and what might be a good first choice and So I encourage you to seek out some of those tools, because communication is everything, especially when it comes to receptivity and having the person really take ownership and move on that. If you'll move on. So again, you guys know I'm coming at this from an angle of this is not meant to be all doom and gloom, because there's so much that we can do. A lot of hope of the R's, the restoration, regeneration, and resilience. If you'll go on. So again, good news. The brain has the capacity to change for the better. Keep going. So we could do a lot. Keep going. So again, as we learn more about the brain, we know what we can do to better these opportunities for people. And we can actually change the brain by how we work with folks. I'm going to have you move on quite a bit because I know I'm down to the end here. So keep going. Keep going. One thing, actually, if you go back one thing you'll see a lot in the context of, say, therapies or interventions is a focus even more after brain injury on restorative as opposed to just compensatory approaches. So helping them see how they can improve. And these are some of the keys: being actively involved and engaged in it, being kind of hitting that level of challenge, sweating it a little, as opposed to just something that's more like a automatic sort of drill, very passive. So it's exciting to think about how we can kind of bring that into their world. If you'll go on to the next one. And, you know, we may kind of touch these folks at any point in the community. It doesn't always happen in the hospital. And really, the child and the family, they're the constant. They're the core. So if you'll go on to wrap up, I think where we see paying the biggest dividends is really having these family-centered approaches. So how can we really empower the family to be that continued support and advocate, and ultimately the child, him or herself, being their best self-advocate. So if you'll keep going. I love examples of families who took this to heart from the beginning. Like, I know one father, they shared their story on Facebook, had millions of followers, a Dallas family, or Arlington family, that like in the hospital, they put a sign up in her room that said, "Only positivity allowed here." You know? So all the staff that came in, I mean, there were some ground rules. Like, we are not going to talk about this, this, and this. Here's what we are going to do. It made a huge difference. And not only in her recovery, but really everybody around her, and how that spurned. So I so appreciate when, you know, again, when families take ownership and recognize the value in that. If you'll move on. Have you guys ever seen this? I encourage you, if you haven't, to look at some of these tools. This is something that came out from the Texas BIA several years ago, but you could click through them so all 10 will show up. These are the top 10 things. They surveyed caregivers, top 10 things that they don't want to hear. And these are caregivers of individuals with brain injury, young and old. And I think one thing that's so important is for us to be mindful of our language and our assumptions and our communication as we interact with families. And if any of y'all are survivors yourself, y'all may be able to relate to some of these. If you'll scroll to the next one, I do like, though, that they boiled it down to the top 3 things we do want to hear. And, you know, a lot of it's about connection, getting them connected to other caregivers who've been there, have that peer support. You know, people who are reaching out with kind of a specific opportunity to re-engage, as opposed to just let me know what I can do to help, you know? And then 2, recognizing how important it is to really take the pulse and temperature of how the caregivers are doing as well. So I know that's common sense for y'all, but I think important for us to acknowledge. If you'll move on. Another thing I encourage, I'm a resource hog. I love to collect stuff like this. So if anybody wants any of these emailed to them, I'm happy to. This is a great series that was done actually through the Brain Injury Association in New York several years ago. And it's really meant for families and caregivers. How can you enhance your communication to lead to proactive interactions and exchanges with your significant other or child with brain injury? It's great, really practical, good stuff. In other words, don't try to have a heavy conversation in the living room with the TV on and the practical things like that. And then likewise, the second one is kind of empowering them about their own ability to sort of be the on-site rehab professional for their child or spouse with brain injury. If you'll move on, it's the very end. Again, also love it when caregivers kind of get the information out there. This is a great blog that was done by a caregiver who also happens to be a clinician and kind of shared the way she's found to really maximize those moments in the day-to-day in recovery. He'll go on. And then just some professional pointers I like to give, thinking about, again, sort of advocates in general, of how we can really support as opposed to just being their frontal lobes for them, right? I say that a lot to parents as well, just parents of kids in general. We want to let them develop these and really give them room to grow. You'll go to the next one. One of my favorites is really being mindful, and I'm breaking this rule right now, being mindful of information overload, right? And then kind of thinking about how we can really help give them tools to prioritize, sort of calibrate mental energy, if you will. Taking mental breaks, I talked about that in my last session too. And this is my fun little kind of call to fun little empowering thing for you guys. I like to think of this acronym of SCORE for your brain health. So S being select, so be selective, reduce, really focus on what's most important and salient. The C being, yes, don't be afraid to compensate and use those tools to help you maximize, but then also optimize. Use your talents to maximize your abilities. I have a wonderful story of a woman who loved gardening, and she found a way to sort of bring that into her own rehabilitation. You'll go to the next slide. The R and SCORE could be a lot of things. It could be regenerate, it could be rest. Recognizing there is potential to affect change, not to just compensate, but to actually improve at that brain level. And then E is empower. I think it's a good reminder for all of us, but I think especially survivors of injury. Believe in yourself. You remember and unforget a great deal more than you credit yourself. We become so focused on the negatives of what I can't do. Gosh, look at what you can do and where you can take that. So we go to the next one. Oh, just by acknowledgments, and if we go down one more. Again, one of my favorite sources for families at large, if y'all haven't checked it out before, brainline.org. They also have one that's specific to pediatric issues, Brainline Kids, and one specific to military, Brainline Military. They're all great. Go to the next one. And then, of course, you're always welcome to reach out to me directly. Always happy to do that. So thank you for your time and attention and interest, and I appreciate y'all.